you still need to go through secure change control processes. You still need to have separation of duty between the folks who are coding and those who are reviewing, and then those who are saying, okay, it's time to go in there. But that's just not done so many times now.
This is a Security Weekly production. Security Weekly is a resource of Cyber Risk Alliance.
The Cybersecurity Collaborative, in conjunction with Cyber Reason, is proud to present CISO Stories. Each week, CISO Stories takes a deep dive on security leadership. The Cybersecurity Collaborative is a unique membership community enabling cybersecurity leaders to work together in a trusted environment. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/CSC. I'm your host, Todd Fitzgerald, and this week we welcome Rebecca Herold, co-founder and president, privacy professor at Symbis LLC.
Todd, well, it's so great to be with you to talk about this really important topic. And as far as this field goes, it kind of found me because my degrees are in mathematics, computer science, and education, and I started my corporate career as a systems engineer. And guess what I actually built at a large multinational financial and healthcare organization? I built their change control system. So that's where I started getting into change controls, but I didn't realize it was a security issue at the time. So as a systems engineer, I spent all this time making this change control system work perfectly to go from, development to test to staging and pilot and then into production. But there were still problems happening with my code, or not my code, but with the code that went into production. And I started thinking, well, what the heck's going on? We had around 1,000 programmers throughout about 10, 12 different business units. So I just started, kind of strolling around to see what was going on. Well, they were defeating my change controls with human actions. Management was supposed to sign off on moving software through those different stages. But what they would do is they would just sign into their mainframe dumb terminal and step away. And then the actual programmer who did the coding would get in there and approve their own code. So anyway, long story short, I saw that happening. I thought, this is not good for the company, for the software. There was an opening in the IT audit area. And I thought, by gosh, I think I could apply for that. And maybe I can do something about these, lack of attention to following the rules. So I went into IT audit. My second audit was to look at the security of the information throughout the whole corporation. And after 7 months, I gave a recommendation that we needed to create a security department. And the management at that time, this was in around 1991 or so, they said, well, you spent 7 months on it, and so you know what needs to be done, so why don't you build it? So basically, that's how I got started in security. And then I got into privacy in 1993, 94, when we were was going to be, and I think it actually was the first online banking system on the internet way back a long time ago. People listening probably can't even imagine there not ever being an internet. But anyway, that went up, and I was responsible for establishing all the security controls for the website. During my research, I determined that we should probably address privacy, because I had run across in the good old-fashioned physical library information about the OECD privacy principles way back then. And I thought, this is good stuff. This is important. Our lawyers should do this. So I asked, my manager about it, and he says, see what you can do. He didn't really want to deal with it. So I happened to come in to work in the mornings at 5:30 a.m. I like to get there before I started getting calls at 7 in the morning, 6 in the morning oftentimes. But anyway, at the same time that I arrived, the CEO of this large corporation also arrived. He ran to work in the morning. So we got to know each other and chatted in the elevator going up, to, I'd always ride up all the way with him so I could talk with him a little bit longer, and then back down to my floor. But anyway, he would ask me about different things that he read in Wall Street Journal. Well, I happened to mention to him, I said, we're putting up a bank. I think we need to address privacy, because he knew I was addressing security. And he said, that sounds like a good idea. Well, he came back to me a day or two later in the elevator, and I said, well, as the general counsel, does he need to speak with me about, these different privacy issues? He says, well, actually, I think it'd be best for you to handle privacy if you think it's important. And I believe you think it's important, because there are no laws addressing privacy at that point in time, right?
Yeah, I mean, looking at that time, if you're talking, early 90s, this is before the EU data directive, before the HIPAA laws, before all of that.
This was even before ISO 27000 series. This was back before there was even a BS 7799 for security. So this was back when I was using the military rainbow catalogs of security controls to find information about this. And again, the OECD privacy principles have been around since, 1980 or so. Mm-hmm. So I always viewed privacy as impacting people's lives with regard to how their personal data was handled and how it was used and shared. So that's kind of always been a part of it, just because from a security standpoint, access to data, knowing how your data is shared and controlling who gets access to it. I mean, that was a part of security. So I guess it grew out of there. So I've always viewed security and privacy going hand in hand with each other, with some of the outliers being, at the edges of these overlaps. And I think HIPAA is a really good way to view it, because, if you look at the HIPAA privacy rule, it talks about, in the privacy rule, it's rights of the people about whom the PHI applies. And it talks about giving them access to their data, giving them an accounting of who's gotten access to it, giving them choices and all this. So it's more administrative and more about the person's rights. Whereas you have to have security involved in order to limit the access, right? That's supporting the privacy rules that have been established. So there are things that are going to be disconnected, but I think there's more overlap there than there is conflict.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. In every organization that I've worked in, you end up, when you're talking about privacy, it seems to bleed into a security discussion around some aspect of it. Mm-hmm. So you wrote a great piece for the book CISO Compass: Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, which you're clearly a pioneer in this space. And you wrote a piece called Change Controls Are More Necessary Than Ever. Could you walk us through that?
Sure. Well, that is one of I have several passions in information security, but of course, since I entered the field through change controls, it's really been a concern of mine, because I've seen some improvements over the years, but I've seen so many things that are just going backwards. So, over the years in the security classes I've taught, and I taught 9.5 years at Norwich University in their master's degree program. And going through there, the importance of program change control management was so necessary in order to avoid having vulnerable code being used. And so it's something that I'm seeing far too many organizations still making changes, Todd, directly in production. And it just drives me nuts because they're like, well, that's okay to do that now. Things aren't the way they used to be, back when you started. And I'm like, yeah, they're much more there's much more complexity because we're going beyond just a mainframe. Now you have to think about change control even more and have those stages of making sure that the code works correctly and is well tested. So not only is that one of the big problems I see with change control, making coding changes directly in production, but also it's the lack of testing. But I want to give you a really quick, another blast from the past type of thing. Do you remember, Todd, and maybe, I'm not sure if you worked in, early in your career on the mainframe or the tools, but when I was in tech support, we had a tool called Omegamon for an IBM.
I do remember that.
Yes. Well, I was on the team that there was 3 of us that had authorization to use that, which was scary as heck because you could make changes in memory while the mainframe was running. And what happened so you had to be very careful with it. And one of my coworkers, and she had been there much longer than I had, was an expert with making changes. Sometimes she needed to go in and tweak memory when things were going wrong in certain ways. She made an error, and all of a sudden, this multi-billion-dollar business, the mainframe went down. So all of the insurance activities came to a screeching halt. All of the, banking came to a screeching halt. And it was less than 10 minutes before the CEO of the company was right down there, standing right behind her chair saying, we need to get the system up. And she kept her cool. I was so impressed. She was able to remember, because that's one thing. There was no log of the change. When you make these changes in memory, it doesn't log that change. So she had to remember and go in and correct it. And she was able to get it back. But that made such an impression upon me, Todd, that change control, that is just a one example of why you should not make changes in production, because things are even more complex now, and there's more systems that making changes directly in a complex system can have some very disastrous results, not only in privacy breaches and security incidents, but just not being able to do important functions like a hospital not being able to continue with their care to their patients.
The article this podcast is based upon can be viewed in the best-selling cybersecurity leadership book, CISO Compass, Navigating Cybersecurity Leadership Challenges with Insights from Pioneers, available at Amazon.com and other booksellers. Yeah, I used to work for American Airlines, and the Sabre system had extreme change control around it, because if somebody put the wrong code in there, you'd bring down a whole operation, which was running several hundred airlines at the time. And so I completely understand that. But how do we today, when we talk about how do you get over it's Agile programming and we need to make these changes quickly, and that would, things would just slow down the process. How do we address that?
Well, I love that question, because when I hear so many shops that do this, they say, well, that's just Agile programming is making changes in production. No, that's not Agile programming to make changes in production. Certainly, you make changes in a way that is much more efficient and much quicker than using the waterfall method or whatever. But you still need to go through this process. In fact, my most recent, on my own talk show, Data Security and Privacy with the Privacy Professor. My last show was exactly about the need for change control. And we used Log4j as an example, because just look at that. That's open source code. Can open source code be secure? Of course it can, but you still need to go through secure change control processes. You still need to have separation of duty between the folks who are coding and those who are reviewing, and then those who are saying, okay, it's time to go in there. But that's just not done so many times now. I mean, we need to get back to the basics, because even as technology evolves, basic security requirements or practices, they still apply. They still apply today. And I fear that too many folks who are just getting into the field, in the last 5, 10, maybe even 15 years ago, oftentimes the viewpoint is, well, we don't have to do that anymore with this type of technology. But just think that vulnerability in that code, Log4j, that was there for over 11 years. So we don't even know if that vulnerability might have been being exploited, and we just didn't know it was being exploited. But if we had maybe a better change control process that was followed, and of course I can't go in the Wayback Machine to see what exactly happened there, but it just seems like the indicators show that it was probably a lack of proper testing before it went into production that allowed for that vulnerability. I doubt if it was truly malicious, but that's a possibility too. But it really is so important to make sure that as our technology becomes even more complex, it makes it more important to have really thorough change management processes in place.
So what sort of things should people be doing in this change management process to help mitigate the risk?
Yes, well, ideally, and in most cases, this can be in place, but you need to have typically 4 different regions. You have your development. That's where you're coding, you're trying things out. If something screws up there, that's okay, because you're in development. There's nothing that is touching anybody in production. So you have development, then you have testing. So it moves into testing where other folks beyond the person who coded it, but also the person who coded it usually, are testing it out. Here's for your listeners, make sure you test not only just to see if your code works, but test to see if your code fails. I don't see organizations, I don't see programmers doing that enough. And that's so important for security, because if all you do is narrow your scope of testing to just the types of expected input to your software, you are not truly doing the full breadth of testing, and you will never know if something that is not expected might be entered that could bring your system down. So
we have this guidance out there. We have the OWASP guidance for good coding practices. Things are known out there, and of course SQL injection always seems to come to the top of that list. Since we have these things, why is it that this is still a struggle in organizations to create this secure code?
Well, that's a great question. And a lot of times I see it as pressure from management, from areas outside of IT, outside of security. Oftentimes the plan for a new system is made and the timeline is established oftentimes with not enough input from the programming area, and or if they have input, too many times I see it's disregarded. And it's like, well, no, we need to get this out there into production so we can have it ready by Christmas time, since that's when we expect that, we're going to put this up online and everybody's going to use it. We're making $1 million, whatever. So I think a big help would be if management understands what is necessary with regard to development of software and associated systems, and understand the time and the necessary requirements. I've seen organizations that have suffered huge breaches where I've heard the leaders of the company, the CEO, and a lot of times it's the marketing and sales VP, who are like, well, no, we don't really need to spend all that much time doing, testing or staging. Just put it out there. If you tried it out once and it worked, it's probably going to work. And if it has a flaw, why then look at Microsoft. They put out patches every week. I've actually heard this from some organizations. They put out patches every week and people expect that. So what's going to be what's the big deal? When people who don't understand IT, when people who don't understand security are the ones making the decisions about how software should be developed and when it's time to put into production, that's when bad things happen. So we need to have our business leaders better understand why this is so important for the success of their business.
So you mentioned that the policies need to be consistently enforced or they won't be very effective. But how do we do that? Do we put penalties in place for noncompliance, or do we try to reward compliance? And how do we balance that if our business leaders are not in support of those policies?
Well, the business leaders, number one, have to be behind you. I mean, I learned that in my example I gave at the beginning. That was one thing. I was so fortunate to have a CEO who, I think it was because I spoke with him almost every day though, right? Mm-hmm. But he understood. And he said, Rebecca, put my name on the CC line of memos if you need to put them out, if there's new policies coming. And I can tell you, before I started doing that, people would ignore the policies. But when they said, when it says, well, if you don't like these, and they see it's the CEO on the copy, just come to see me, nobody wanted to talk to him about it, because they knew that since he allowed his name on there, that he supported what this was. So having business leader buy-in is absolutely important. And then with regard to not following policy, that's when you need to have actual policies and procedures for your security folks, your HR folks to look at, to actually go through. I mean, you don't want to punish everybody the same. If you had one person who, made a fingering problem on the keyboard and something bad happened, and that ended up being a violation, versus someone who maliciously planned to do something bad. So there has to be consequences, but those consequences, that's where you need to look at the levels of the consequences and what needs to be done. Maybe with somebody who would just misfinger something, it's like, okay, well, let's provide you with some training or retake this training class, and maybe that'll refresh your memory about how to do this better. But somebody who's malicious about it, that might be worth, your fired time.
Yeah. These are great tips, Rebecca. And I really love this piece because it's something that I think kind of gets glossed over a lot. When we especially in the noise of everything that we're talking about today with cybersecurity and how important this is. Before we leave here, any final thoughts that you want to share with our CISOs out there?
Yes. So for the CISOs, definitely, make sure that you communicate. I mean, like I kind of mentioned throughout our time here, having a good relationship with the top management and making sure they understand the need for security and privacy and the need to get your input on the type of resources and time that is necessary to be effective with your efforts. That is important. So I would say, if anything, put forth some effort to really get to know your business leaders and listen to them. Don't just tell them things, listen to them so you know how to frame that need to them in a way that they'll understand.
Well, this has been excellent, and thanks for all that you do in the industry, your contributions to the CISO Compass book, and I know you contributed to the CISO Leadership book in the early 2000s as well. So I really appreciate the time that you take in the industry to share your privacy knowledge. So thank you very much.
It was a pleasure, Todd. Always enjoy speaking with you.
Thank you.
Cybereason is the champion for today's defenders, providing an endpoint security platform to prevent, detect, and respond to malicious operations on computers, mobile devices, servers, and the cloud. Cybereason. End cyber attacks from endpoints to the enterprise to everywhere. Learn more at cybereason.com/CISO stories.